A big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this episode. In the Cold War skies, one aircraft built for one job stood out, not just for its blistering speed or futuristic silhouette, but because it almost didn't exist. Designed in the late 1940s, it was a jet so powerful that it could hit 40,000 feet in under 150 seconds, chase down Soviet bombers, haul in Concorde, and even reached a high-flying legendary U-2 spy plane. But despite its performance, this aircraft was nearly a casualty of politics. And even when it entered service, it did so with constant budget cuts, cancelled upgrades, and crippling fuel limits that gave it a combat range shorter than most sports cars. But pilots and schoolboys alike adored it. It flew fast, it climbed faster, and looked like a missile with wings. But behind that speed was a bittersweet story of what could have been. This is the story of the glorious English Electric Lightning, Britain's first and only homegrown supersonic point defence interceptor to enter active service. So as always, make yourself a nice cup of tea as we climb vertically like a homesick angel into the history, technology and engineering of one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever to take to the skies. Before we continue, I want to thank War Thunder for sponsoring this episode. If you fancy strapping into the Lightning and taking her vertical, now you can in War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. With over 2,500 vehicles to choose from tanks, aircraft, helicopters and ships, spanning more than a century of military history, you can really get stuck in. From the biplanes and armoured cars of 1920s to cutting-edge modern fighter jets and main battle tanks, every vehicle is modelled in stunning detail with 4K graphics and authentic sound effects for really absorbing games. I've been playing in War Thunder's aircraft simulator mode where I get to fly from the cockpit, which is incredibly fun and intense, diving into chaotic furball dogfights in some beautifully rendered aircraft. War Thunder has just released Hornet Sting, where you can now fly the 4th gen carrier-capable FA-18 or take the Su-30SM heavy fighter into combat. Those thrust vectoring nozzles are going to be so much fun. And if you prefer keeping your feet on the ground, you can roll out an Armada Clovis-like tank armed with both a 105mm cannon and a 20mm autocannon. You can join the 70 million players today in epic PvP battles and discover the incredible wealth of content War Thunder has to offer. As I mentioned, War Thunder is free to play and available on PC, PlayStation and Xbox. If you use my link in the description, you'll get a 7-day premium account, 100,000 silver lions to spend on upgrades and a chance to fly the legendary Curtiss P-40 Warhawk into battle. Plus with premium, you'll earn 50% more rewards and silver lions from every match, so it's the perfect way to get off the ground fast. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. The development of the Lightning began in the years just after the Second World War, when jet technology was still new. In 1945, Allied forces were busily rooting through the wreckage of the Third Reich's many factories and workshops and were shocked by how advanced German aviation had become despite the country being in ruins. Here they discovered jet engines, swept-wing designs and other innovations far ahead of what the Allies had developed. While the British had only produced one operational jet aircraft powered by a centrifugal flow engine, the Germans had already built the Me-262, Arado 234 Blitz, Heinkel He-162 Volksjager, and finally the Heinkel He-280, all powered by the more advanced Junkers, BMW or Heinkel axial flow turbojets. However, these engines didn't last long in service because of poor quality materials, but they were still a sign of how far German engineers had pushed jet design. At the time, the RAF had just started using the Meteor, while the US was only beginning to adopt jets, whereas German engineers were far ahead in high-speed flight research. For instance, they discovered that as aircraft approached transonic speeds, airflow over the wings created shockwaves and increased drag. To counter this, they introduced wing sweep, which reduced wave drag and improved performance. Compared to the Meteor straight wings, the Swallow looked like it had arrived from the future. The first British fighter to have any sweepback was the de Havilland Venom, a development of the Vampire, although still powered by centrifugal engines. It would be up to Supermarine with their troubled Swift before any British frontline fighter had any pronounced swept-wing configuration. It wasn't until the Hunter that Britain had an effective swept-wing frontline fighter, and the Hunter, as capable as she was, could only go supersonic in a shallow dive. And at the time, the only aircraft under construction that would have been capable of Mach 1 in level flight was the Miles M52. This was the pioneering British supersonic design, intended to fly at 1,000 miles an hour and reach a height of 36,000 feet in 90 seconds, with its single 17,000-pound thrust power jet three-stage gas turbine. And it was expected to climb to 50,000 feet, still supersonic. This little aircraft had short-span ultra-thin wings that were completely unswept, and the pilot would have been seated in a semi-prone position within a pressurized nose cone, centrally positioned inside a circular air intake wrapped around the fuselage. I honestly can't imagine this arrangement being too popular with the pilots. However, in February 1946, the Miles project would be abandoned out of the blue by the Attlee government, with no warning given. 1 minute was all smiles and backslaps, and the next minute it was binned. This was despite the design of the aircraft being almost complete and the construction of the first 3 prototypes well underway. The director of scientific research at the time decreed that supersonic flight was simply too dangerous, if not impossible. Until then, attempts in the late 1940s to break the sound barrier had already cost the life of test pilot Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., who had lost his life while carrying out high-speed tests in the DH-108 tailless research aircraft. Of course, the post-war Labour government of the day, bent on cutting costs wherever possible, went along with it, claiming that it was too expensive. And so the future for a British supersonic aircraft didn't look promising. With severe post-war economic constraints, the British government under Prime Minister Clement Attlee adopted an unofficial policy often summarised as no new fighters until 1957, relying instead on stopgap designs like the Gloucester Meteor and Vampires to protect the skies around Britain. But in 1946, over at English Electric, Chief Engineer W.E.W. Teddy Petter was working on an aircraft that would make sticking with obsolete fighters look short-sighted. The aircraft coming together at the English Electric Assembly Hall in the northern English town of Preston was a twin-engine, high-altitude, high-speed Canberra. An aircraft that her designer, Petter, a brilliant mind behind earlier aircraft such as the Westland Lysander, the Whirlwind and now the Canberra Bomber, understood more than anyone that his Canberra could easily evade the likes of the Meteor and Vampires. And if those British fighters struggled to reach his bomber, they'd no doubt have trouble reaching any potential fast high-flying Soviet bombers. With this notion in mind, he made some simple provisional sketches of a twin-engine swept-wing fighter capable of reaching Mach 2. Quite optimistic since all Britain had at the time were centrifugal engines, and very little was known about swept-wing designs other than what scraps we'd managed to save after our American and Russian friends had rifled through the treasure trove of German data and taken the best bits for themselves. Petter's supersonic design revolved around creating a simple, compact airframe with minimal drag and maximum thrust. Central to this concept was a unique vertical engine configuration with 2 centrifugal flow Rolls-Royce Derwent engines. That's all there really was engine-wise, and these would be mounted one above the other in the fuselage and fed by a single nose intake. But Petter's design did away with the prone piloting position, to which, to no one's surprise, was not favoured by anyone, and in any case, that arrangement offered no real significant advantage with his 2-engine configuration. Once he was done with his drawings, he presented them to the Air Ministry, which naturally showed no interest. Well, no bother. In any event, the Canberra was occupying everyone's attention back at English Electric, so his supersonic designs would have to be filed away for the time being. But just as Britain had cancelled the M52, 2 events would take place over in America that would demonstrate to everyone who really was the world leader in aircraft development. On the 1st of October 1947, the XP-86 prototype of the North American Sabre had its maiden flight. This was the Western world's first post-war swept-wing fighter and was destined to become one of the world's greatest combat aircraft of all time. Then just 2 weeks later, on October the 14th, Chuck Yeager made history by becoming the first man to break the sound barrier in level flight, flying the Bell X-1 airdrop from a Boeing B-29 at high altitude, reaching Mach 1.06. Although a full-scale manned version of the Miles M52 never flew, a scaled-down remotely piloted model, did make it into the air when it was air-launched from a de Havilland Mosquito on the 8th of October 1947. But its rocket motor failed shortly after launch and exploded. Just 6 days later, Chuck Yeager would go on to break the sound barrier. I'm not one to point fingers, but the Bell X-1 did bear a striking resemblance to the Mars M52 design in a few areas. As a result of these events, in 1948 the Air Ministry once again became interested in supersonic flight, and the Advanced Fighter Project Group was established at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough in March 1948. After a summer of working to come up with some performance numbers, an unofficial requirement letter was sent out to a handful of aircraft firms asking for design ideas for a single-seat research aircraft to have a maximum speed of Mach 1.21 at 45,000 feet with the potential to go to Mach 1.4. The engine suggested at the time would be the Rolls-Royce AJ65 Avon turbojet, though it also needed the potential to be developed as a fighter that would be armed with a pair of 30mm Aden cannon. Multiple firms, such illustrious names like Boulton Paul, Bristol, Fairey, Gloucester, Hawker, Armstrong Whitworth, and of course English Electric, threw their hats into the ring, hoping that this request for information may lead to some work for their factories. So against this backdrop, Petter, having received the requirements, wanted the design his firm submitted to be a functional supersonic fighter rather than a disposable experimental platform. In early 1948, Petter started to assemble his team, with Freddie Page set to direct the effort to find the best layout, and Ray Creasy, who had also been working on supersonic designs with a deep understanding of compressibility, was put in charge of aerodynamics. Both men had worked closely with Petter on the Canberra, and just to avoid any confusion, this Freddie was not Sir Freddie Hanley Page of the Hanley Page fame. The layout more or less followed Petter's original 1946 sketches for an aircraft with twin axial flow engines mounted inside the fuselage, stacked one above the other, basically a tube with two very powerful engines, or as her pilots would soon call her, the aluminium death tube. This would be a very different beast from the Meteor and Vampire. The stacked engine approach had the benefit of no asymmetrical thrust issues if one of them failed, and it would prove to be a very easy aircraft to fly on one engine, although the catastrophic failure of one engine would knock out the other one. But on the upside, if one engine did survive, there was no additional intake drag to worry about. However, everything comes at a cost. Mounting the engines in the fuselage left little room for fuel. This generally wouldn't be an issue for experimental aircraft, but for the Lightning, it would become its Achilles heel. This aircraft would have a nose intake, as it was thought that although fuselage side intakes at the wing roots would reduce the length of ducting needed, they could suffer from serious flow separations. To ensure high-speed performance, Petter and the team adopted a sharply swept wing with a leading edge angle of 40 degrees, a shape that resembled a truncated delta. However, this raised the question, could large incident angles or wing tilt end up blanketing the fin and tailplane? At this point, an unusual design choice emerged. Twin sharply swept tailplanes positioned clear of the fuselage wake, each paired with equally swept fins, but this idea was quickly binned and never spoken of again. Instead, Petter considered a day's fashion for a while, a single fin with a tailplane mounted atop, much like that on a Gloucester Javelin as seen in the diagram. Although the die was not yet cast, by the late 1940s, a new kind of aircraft design was catching on for high-speed flying, the tailless delta wing. What follows can be complex, but I will try to explain it in the most non-technical way I possibly can. In these delta designs, instead of having a regular tail at the back, these aircraft use a single triangular wing with control surfaces on the trailing edges called elevons to pitch the nose up and down or roll the aircraft right or left. You can see these elevons in aircraft like the Fairey FD-2 and the British Vulcan, the French Mirage and the Americans Convair F-102. This setup worked well at subsonic speeds, but as these aircraft approached supersonic flight, engineers ran into a problem. The balance point of air pressure on the aeroplane, what's called the aerodynamic center, starts to shift backwards, and this shift of aerodynamic center could make the aircraft unstable. Now engineers began to wonder if ailerons alone would be enough to keep the Interceptor under control during high-speed maneuvers like high-speed turns, especially at high altitude. So the design was changed. Instead of a tailless design, they went with a more traditional layout. A main wing and a separate tailplane both swept back 60 degrees. Ultimately, they ended up with its main wing mounted low on the fuselage and a tailplane attached lower down on the vertical fin, a layout that became the final design choice. As for the other firms who'd also submitted designs, Armstrong Whitworth put forward their AW58. This was ordered but was later cancelled. Fairey had also put forward a design, despite being better known for manufacturing naval aircraft. The Fairey design was looked upon favourably by the Air Ministry and were later awarded a contract under specification ER-103 in 1950 to build their supersonic FD-2, which first flew in 1954 and went on to set speed record. Over at English Electric, they too submitted their drawings in 1950, for which they were awarded a contract to proceed with scale models for wind tunnel testing, and £10,000, or about $500,000 in 2025 money, more than enough to cover their costs for tea and biscuits. Before work on a full-scale aircraft could be started, English Electric ramped up its development resources. Significantly, the company used a scrap Neen jet engine to build a wind tunnel, creating the first private transonic wind tunnel outside the USA. Here's an interesting anecdote I read while researching. Due to the engine noise from the Neen, the wind tunnel was placed at the far end of the English Electric site at Wharton, with the jet exhaust pointing out over a cow pasture. One day the farm owner came to Petter complaining that the engine's roar was troubling his cows, worrying his sheep and affecting milk production, and unless something were done about the racket, he'd be compelled to demand compensation for his anxious herd. The next day the engine was run again. Much to the amazement of the engineers, the cows wandered over and stood in the wake of the jet exhaust, enjoying the warmth it provided. Needless to say, they never heard from the farmer again once they pointed out how his cows seemed to be enjoying the free heating. Testing with wind tunnel models continued until it was thought that the wing and tail positions had been determined, but there was a point of contention between English Electric engineers and the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The engineers favoured a 60-degree wing sweep, with the trailing edge having a sweep of 52 degrees, and the tailplane mounted as low as it would be possible on the rear fuselage, as it would avoid the wing's turbulent wake and improve pitch control during low-speed and transonic flight. English Electric had maintained throughout that the pitch-up problems plaguing the current generation of transonic fighters were due to their tailplanes being in the wrong relative positions. In those designs, the tailplanes were either level with the wing trailing edge and directly in the wing wake downwash, or in some cases were the newly fashionable high-position T-tail, which in English Electric's view was even worse. Still, the configuration was opposed by the civil servants at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, who instead preferred a 50-degree swept wing and a T-tail, following the fashion of the day, considering English Electric's arrangement too dangerous. To settle this argument, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, which was acting as the Ministry's technical advisor, persuaded the men at the Ministry to commission a low-speed test aircraft to be built by Short Brothers and Harland in Belfast. This testbed, designated the SB-5 under specification ER-100, was to be powered by a 1,500-pound thrust Viper engine, giving her a blistering top speed of 311 miles an hour. However, I must point out that some sources state that it was powered by a Derwent jet. Anyway, whichever jet was fitted, the SB-5 seriously lacked guts, taking almost 30 minutes at full power to reach 7,000 feet, its absolute service ceiling. It was by all accounts a very simple machine, with basic cable-operated controls and a very Spartan cockpit. But what it lacked in speed, power and other luxuries, it made up for being a quirky little thing. It was remarkably adaptable. Its wings, made of plywood with light alloy sheeting, could be swapped out for interchangeable sweep angles of 50, 60 and 69 degrees, although some sources have it as 70 degrees. The complete rear fuselage just after the engine could also be detached and swapped out for one of three alternative rear assemblies. one with the tailplane set on top of the fin, the other with the tailplane set in the middle, and the final one in the low position. Bizarrely, it also had a fixed undercarriage. I'm unsure, but I believe this was one of the only jets, if not the only jet with this arrangement. Please correct me in the comments if I'm mistaken. The SB-5 first flew from Boscombe Down with Short's chief test pilot Tom Brooks Smith on the 2nd of December 1952, by which time the English Electric prototype was taking shape. Therefore, the flights of the SB-5 may have appeared to be an exercise in futility and navel gazing, since rather than starting with the setup which English Electric was proposing and proving them wrong from the get-go, which was the whole purpose of the SB-5, they instead took a gradual, safe approach, starting with the minimum sweep with the T-tail, and then cautiously working their way through all the wing and tail configurations. The irony was that the SB-5's first flight would be what they considered to be the safest configuration of 50 degrees sweep and a T-tail, which English Electric did not consider safe at all for stall investigation. This configuration was liable to result in a deep stall, characteristics which had been the cause of losses during the development of the F-104 Starfighters, Gloster Javelins, Tridents, and others with T-tail configuration. This ill-advised, timid approach meant that it wasn't until 1953 or 54, dependent on the source, that the SB-5 was rigged up with the 60-degree wing and low-set tailplane matching that of the P-1. As it turned out, this finally validated English Electric's low all-moving tailplane philosophy, especially with the 60-degree swept wing configuration, proving that placing a tailplane anywhere else would have resulted in it being blanked out by the wings at a certain angle of attack. You can imagine the eye-rolling and told-you-sos back at Wharton, but nevertheless, she did provide valuable aerodynamic data to support English Electric's P1 design. While flying the SB-5, Brooks Smith discovered late in the testing program, with the 60-degree swept wing at specific high angles of attack, a sharp wing drop occurred due to tip stalls. These findings were backed up with wind tunnel and water tests at Wharton, which suggested that adding wing fences or a series of notches would soften the tip stalls. Both were tried in flight and both were effective, with the notches being chosen as they were lighter and simpler and obviously imposed a much smaller drag penalty. It was later confirmed that the manually controlled ailerons had been the cause of the wing drop experienced on the SB-5. However, the notches were added on the P-1A, this time for transonic aerodynamic reasons, and as a practical location for fuel tank vents. One significant design change was relocating ailerons to the squared off wingtips, giving the aileron hinge line zero sweep, and avoiding loss of control effectiveness encountered in early examples of swept wing designs. This helped prevent roll control issues that could arise during crosswind landings or at high angles of attack, problems common in other swept-wing aircraft with traditionally placed ailerons. With the trailing edge freed up, it could be fully dedicated to flaps. I should also mention that crosswind landings had lightning pilot's eyes on stalks. The stacked engine design and towering fin gave the aircraft a huge broadside profile, making it highly sensitive to crosswinds. As a result, approaches had to be flown at a swift 180 knots and touchdown at 150, requiring a runway ideally 7,500 feet long. A sufficiently strong crosswind during one take of a landing cycle could shred a complete set of its fin tyres. In the end, Shorts did fit the SB-5 with the more powerful Bristol Orpheus engine, doubling its power before testing with the 69-degree wing sweep, which at the time was the greatest wing sweep in the world. 69 degrees, not 68, but 69, for scientific purposes, of course, only for that reason. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now, let's get back to the story. While Shorts were flying around in their wooden wing jet, the Ministry, being sufficiently satisfied with the data the firm's engineers had provided, awarded English Electric a contract in mid-1950 to build two prototypes of the P1 under specification F-23/49 as research aircraft, along with one structural fatigue test airframe. These were later designated P1As. But at Wharton, there was trouble at mill.
Trouble at mill.
Oh no. What sort of trouble?
One on crossbeam's gone out of skew on treadle.
Just as they received the work in 1950, Petter left the company, citing disagreements with management, moving to Folland, another aircraft manufacturer, to pursue his designs without relying on government funding. Please take a moment to watch the Folland Nap video to find out more what Teddy Petter accomplished at Folland. So even though Petter wouldn't see the Lightning through to completion and wouldn't be able to claim the Lightning as his creation, it's undisputed that he did contribute to the initial critical stages that led to the development of the first British jet aircraft to achieve Mach 2 in level flight. But what's not disputed is that without his contributions to English Electric's reputation and his initial suggestions to the Air Ministry with his sketches for a supersonic aircraft, they probably wouldn't have even been given the opportunity to participate in what became the P1 and Lightning program. And so with Petter's departure, the program fell into the very capable hands of Freddie Page with Ray Creasy as his deputy. Work to build the first 3 P1s began, all hand-built at Salisbury Aerodrome near the town of Blackburn in the Ribble Valley district of Lancashire. And to avoid confusion, not Blackburn Aircraft Manufacturer, which is in Yorkshire. And this would be where all future Lightnings would be born. The first prototype off the line, Whiskey Golf 760, had a simple egg-shaped intake and without that distinctive Lightning nose cone. Also, not to delay flight testing, it was fitted with a pair of Armstrong Whitworth Sapphire SA5 engines, each delivering 8,100 pounds of thrust with no reheat. Although capable of pushing the P1 past Mach 1, it was not the engine of choice due to poor throttle response. But since the engine of choice, the more powerful Rolls-Royce Avon, was not yet ready, the big pair of Sapphires would have to suffice. The engines were staggered to maintain a reasonable centre of gravity, with the lower engine being number 1 and sitting quite far forward of the number 2 engine above. I've always remembered it as picturing floors in a building. Number 1 at the bottom, number 2 at the top. I'm a bit slow like that. Her 60-degree wings were of conventional construction, built around 2 main spars with a series of closely spaced ribs and stringers riveted along the outer panels. The main stalky undercarriage units retracted into bays set into the lower wing skin and hung between 2 heavy-duty forgings mounted between the main spars. I read somewhere somebody once wrote that the Lightning has the aesthetic elegance of a flying filing cabinet, painted red, and it could be mistaken for a London bus with wings, but without the drunks and the smell of stale KFC takeout. Because the Lightning was not a small aircraft, being 55 feet 3 inches in length, 19 feet 7 inches tall, and a wingspan of 34 feet 10 inches, a London bus is just 36 foot long and 14 feet tall. In the areas designed to carry fuel, the wings used integral tanks, meaning they didn't house separate tanks inside. The wing was the tank, as in the wing structure itself was sealed to hold fuel directly. Clever stuff. This approach saved weight and made more room for fuel without cluttering the wing with bulky internal tanks. But of course, there was a catch. These integral tanks depended on sealant to keep the fuel from leaking through the countless rivets, joints and panel seams. And as you might expect, leaks became a bit of a trademark, especially as airframes aged and got rattled around by high-speed flight, so great for range, not so great for dry hangar floors. In a 2013 Fly Past magazine interview, Chief Technician Dave Branchett recalled, "Right from the start, 2 things became apparent. First was that this aeroplane leaked, I mean really leaked, as in like a sieve. Every aircraft in the hangar had at least 5 cut-down fuel drums under it to catch the drips. There were even small drain pipes to duct leaks from internal danger areas to outside the fuselage. The flaps, which were designed to contain fuel, hemorrhaged so badly that they were blanked off and remained dry. I suppose on the upside, when it stopped leaking, you knew it was out of fuel." Joking aside, the Lightning's fuel capacity would be its Achilles heel until the very end, and engineers would use every nook and cranny to store fuel. But from the P1B model onwards, a ventral fuel tank would be carried. We'll come back to the fuel issues later on. Whiskey Golf 760 was also fitted with a Q artificial field unit, as it was thought that because the aircraft was fitted with powered controls, the pilot might overstress the aircraft. This cue system gave the pilot the same feedback that he would have had with manual controls. Since it was calculated that the runway at Warton was going to be too short for the P1, which they calculated would have an approach speed between 180 and 200 knots, it was thought safer to use the longer runway at RAF Boscombe Down. Therefore, in May 1954, the P1 Whiskey Golf 760 was shipped by road to Boscombe Down for taxi trials, where they tested the brakes, nose wheel steering and braking parachute. This last piece was rated up to 200 knots. When all the tests were complete, the date for the maiden flight was set for the 3rd of August 1954. But Roland Beaumont, the legend who was to make the first flight, managed to accidentally set off the engine bay fire suppression system, a right old mess that took the whole day to clean up. Finally, the next day at 10 AM on the 4th of August 1954, Whiskey Golf 760, piloted by Wing Commander Roland B. Beaumont, the company's chief test pilot, took off into clear English skies. The first flight lasted just 33 minutes, but long enough for Beaumont to report that the aircraft proved stable and easily trimmed across most of its flight envelope. While small pitch changes occurred near Mach 1 due to shifts in aerodynamic center, the aircraft displayed no significant pitching issues other than when the undercarriage and flaps were raised. On the 11th of August, English Electric was ready to push their radical 60-degree swept wing creation past the Mach 1 barrier. The spot chosen for this monumentous occasion was over the English Channel, safely out of earshot of any sensitive civilian ears. This was after the Ministry of Supply politely told English Electric that they were not to break the sound barrier over land. The Americans had already learned the hard way that going through Mach 1 in level flight meant unleashing a rolling double boom along the entire ground track, which tended to upset the locals. On the other hand, engineers eagerly anticipated the boom and were confident that the P1 would be the first British aircraft to break past Mach 1 in level flight and, more importantly, be practical. With that, Beaumont again added controls of Whiskey Golf 760 for its third sortie, taking just 3 minutes to climb to 30,000 feet on that clear sunny day over the English south coast, push the throttles to the stops. It was Mach 1 or bust. However, no matter what, the Mach meter refused to go past Mach 0.98. Disappointed, he returned to base. But 24 hours later, it was confirmed that he'd officially exceeded the speed of sound in level flight, the first British aircraft to achieve this distinction. It turned out that the Mach meter had been poorly calibrated. Although there are some accounts that unwittingly Beaumont had already exceeded Mach 1 on the maiden flight, but due to the same faulty Mach meter, it was not noticed until the flight data from the initial flight was analysed. How much truth there is to the story is unclear, as surely there would have been a sonic boom regardless of the faulty instrument. Speaking of test data, because the P1 was far outside anything that had been built before, engineers were concerned how the airframe would cope with the excessive flutter and vibration. At the time, a new piece of kit had been cobbled together by the chaps at the Royal Aircraft Establishment called a vibrograph. The idea was simple: fire off a few small explosive charges called exciters, which were mounted on the wingtips to deliberately shake the aircraft mid-flight, then record the resulting vibrations for analysis. Amusingly, this whole process was known as bonking. Focus, chaps, focus. Now, during one of these flutter test flights, the pilot hit the switch, the exciters went off, shaking the airframe doing their job. But the exciters were followed by an unexpected, much larger bang. The whole canopy was blown clean off. Fortunately, the very startled pilot kept his wits about him and managed to bring the aircraft down in one piece. Later investigations showed a failure in the canopy locking mechanism, which was duly fixed, and further bonking flights passed without incident. Later in 1954, the whole team and aircraft returned to Warton, where the runway had just been lengthened to 7,500 feet or approximately 2,300 meters, and is still the longest private runway in the UK and the fourth longest in good old Blighty. For the next few years, Whiskey Golf 760 would be put through her paces, sometimes flying 3 to 4 times a day, ironing out kinks and bugs. It wasn't until the summer of 1955 that she was re-engined with a pair of reheated Sapphires, as Whiskey Golf 760 had pretty much maxed out the performance of the existing Sapphire SA5s. While the re-engine work was underway, the second prototype, Whiskey Golf 763, made her maiden flight from a lengthened runway at Wharton on the 18th of July 1955. Whiskey Golf 763 was, from the get-go, earmarked as the weapons test airframe, and as such was fitted with a pair of 30mm Aiden cannon in the upper nose. She was also fitted with a ventral fuel tank that held 2,000 gallons, and to eke out every nook for fuel, even the flaps were modified as additional fuel tanks. Fuel in the flaps. What next? Guns in the fuel tanks? With these guns and ventral tanks, the aircraft was officially redesignated the P-1A. If I may add, this is one of those strange ironies that the same company which made its name with the Canberra, arguably one of the most versatile military aircraft ever built at the time, then spent the next decade slowly strangling its own supersonic creation by not sorting out the fuel capacity or lack thereof. But then I suppose it's essential to bear in mind that the Lightning was designed as a point defense interceptor, initially to guard the V-bomber bases and target enemy bombers before they could reach the British mainland, and where every second counts, fuel consumption was secondary. It was simply not expected to get into a drawn-out furball fight with MiGs. One of the main findings of these flight tests, which extended the flight envelope up to Mach 1.52, was that the design was short of supersonic directional stability, and there was a persistent buzzing above a certain speed, which was traced back to the fin and rudder assembly. Further investigation concluded that a major redesign would be needed to prevent potential structural failure. Naturally, as so not to delay the program, it was decided to fit dampeners, which apparently became standard on all future aircraft. If there are any Lightning engineers here, please let me know in the comments if this is correct. Finally, work to re-engine Whiskey Golf 760 was completed at the end of January 1956, now sporting a fresh pair of Sapphires with a crude and rudimentary reheat system to boost the thrust to 12,000 pounds each. However, worryingly, they only managed 5,500 pounds thrust dry, which meant that in the event of an engine failure, the unfortunate pilot would need to consider putting up the for sale sign and punch out. It wasn't long before these new engines proved their worth, getting to 40,000 feet in just over 3 minutes. But as spectacular as this was, no matter how hard they tried, Whiskey Golf 760 wouldn't push past Mach 1.56, and the buzzing had returned. Now it was thought that perhaps the airframe had reached its limits. At one point, Whiskey Golf 760 was fitted with a new set of 55-degree swept-back wings, which increased fuel capacity and aimed to push the aircraft closer to achieving Mach 2. However, Freddie Page was reluctant to test this new configuration with the 55-degree wings to the promised land of double-digit Mach, hoping that the following prototype, the P-1B, using their data gathered from the P-1 and the SB-5 test aircraft and the wind tunnel at Wharton, would be the machine to achieve that magical number. With the designs of the new P-1B finalised, Freddie submitted them to the Ministry of Supply, which subsequently awarded a contract to construct 23 airframes, of which 3 would be used for flight and weapons testing, and the remaining 20 would be used as production development aircraft and later on redesignated as the Lightning F1. Due to the data gleaned from the extensive testing, it's unsurprising that the P-1B looked different. Gone was the oval nose intake, to be replaced with the round duct centered with the iconic conical bullet that would soon become home to the AI-23 radar. And, as much as I love your comments, specifically the ones about my inability to pronounce words starting with TH, this was not a copy of the MiG-21, no more than the Tu-144 was a copy of Concorde. Unlike the Lightning's fixed nose cone, which housed a large radar for long-range interception, the MiG-21 used a movable cone that shifted forward and back depending on speed. This clever design helped manage supersonic airflow into the engine, but the limited space inside the cone meant the MiG's radar had to be smaller, fine for short range but limited in detection range. The Lightning, by comparison, gave priority to radar size and power, which suited its role as a dedicated high-speed bomber hunter. The pilot now sat under an improved bulbous canopy that was fed into a raised dorsal spine into which the engine start equipment was crammed, and like the P-1A, the B was fitted with a pair of Hendon cannon on the upper nose. Pylons were mounted on the lower forward fuselage to carry the infrared homing air-to-air Blue Jay missile, later renamed the Firestreak. Other weapons that could be bolted on included the Hendon gun pack that could carry 240 rounds, a very basic gun sight that was difficult to operate and generally disliked by pilots, and a pair of drop-down microsol pods, each loaded with 24 folding fin aerial rockets. But the most significant improvement over earlier versions was the installation of a new pair of Rolls-Royce Avon R24 Mach 210 engines. These Avons came with variable nozzle reheat, producing 15,000 pounds of static sea level thrust each, with reheat, providing a 1-to-1 power to weight ratio that could send the aircraft almost, and I say almost, vertical at Mach 1. And many a schoolboy has had his life changed watching a Lightning take off and then immediately be stood on its tail and send its pilot to the moon. In fact, the power of these engines saw quite a few new pilots accidentally go supersonic in a Lightning. Accidentally, right. But this performance came at a price. Fuel again was an issue. It had, like the P1, inadequate capacity, holding just 6,000 pounds, which according to Roland Beaumont in his book Testing Years, flights were limited to around 30-40 minutes only, leaving just 800 pounds of fuel in the tanks by the time they returned to Wharton, hardly enough for one missed approach. Beaumont even wrote that the Lightning wouldn't stand a cat's hell-in chance of getting export orders as a fighter unless the internal fuel capacity was at least doubled. But that wouldn't happen until 1963 when the F3 showed up with a 10,000 pound fuel capacity, finally giving it some manner of legs, and only then did foreign customers like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait start showing interest. The Avons were started using isopropyl nitrate or AVPIN stored in a 3-gallon tank tucked away in a dorsal spine. It was enough for about 6 starts. At the best of times, it was challenging to operate and easily contaminated by water in bad weather, where it would fail to work due to some valve getting stuck, forcing a ground crew to clamber up onto the Lightning and whack the stuck valve with a mallet. Not only that, it was a nasty, toxic, corrosive, volatile substance that would ignite without oxygen, something that caused more than a few squeaky bum moments under the blazing Middle Eastern sun. More on that later. Despite this, the P-1B had a climb rate of 40,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. In effect, the Lightning would double the performance of Fighter Command in one step from the Hunter, as had the Canberra from the Lincoln in Bomber Command. Not bad from a company better known for making household appliances and trains. Because these new Avon engines were slightly larger than the earlier Sapphires, the fuselage had to be deepened, which meant that the cockpit could be raised, which improved rearward vision from practically non-existent to very difficult. Ideally, the Lightning could have benefited from a bubble canopy like the F-15 or F-16. However, there were some plus sides to raising a cockpit, in that it created more room for additional systems, such as the bleed air system that directed airflow over the windshield to remove rain. But with all these new systems, the P-1B was quickly becoming a plumber's nightmare that many a poor technician would curse, as getting to one faulty part typically meant having to remove many other bits and pieces. After much hard work, the first P-1B, serial X-Ray Alpha 857, took to the skies on the 4th of April 1957 without any autopilot or auto-stabilizers as a time-saving measure, and was even flown to Mach 1.2 on her maiden flight. Not a bad show for a first outing. But a month later, an event took place that could have killed the project entirely when Duncan Sands issued the now infamous 1957 Defence White Paper. That year, newly appointed Minister of Defence Duncan Sands announced that the British government was to make a strategic shift to place more emphasis on guided missiles, many still in development, as central to future air defence, reducing reliance on manned fighter aircraft. Although the paper didn't explicitly declare manned aircraft obsolete, but instead argued that the primary threat to the UK now came from Soviet ballistic missiles rather than manned bombers. Consequently, new interceptor and reconnaissance aircraft projects were deemed less critical. The consequences were immediate and severe. The White Paper led to the cancellation of most major advanced aircraft programs, including Avro 730 supersonic reconnaissance bomber, advanced derivatives of the Gloucester Javelin interceptor, and the Hawker P-1121 supersonic fighter bomber, just to name a few. The fallout reshaped the British aviation industry. Many historic firms, such as Sanders Roe and Gloucester, struggled without any government contracts and were either absorbed into larger conglomerates like Hawker Siddeley or the British Aircraft Corporation, or just simply faded away. Contrary to some, Duncan Sands did not terminate all manned aircraft programs. Projects like the English Electric Lightning Interceptor and the V-bombers continued. These cuts, while pragmatic, were deeply unpopular and had long-term consequences for the aviation sector. But in the 1950s, Britain's aviation industry was weighed down by inefficiencies, with nearly 30 companies often chasing similar aircraft concepts, resulting in duplicated efforts, rising costs and delayed development. Heaven knows that talent here was not in short supply, but spreading resources so thinly made it difficult to concentrate expertise or maintain focused, cost-effective progress, making rationalization all but inevitable. Although the Lightning was spared, narrowly escaping cancellation, largely because too much time, effort and money had already been invested. Unfortunately, that same logic or sentiment would not be extended to the TSR-2 in '65. In favour, as one of my aviation friends once said, for a flying hunk of junk called the F-111. I think Sir Sidney Cam put it beautifully when he said, all modern aircraft have 4 dimensions: span, length, height and politics. TSR-2 simply got the first 3 right. Look, I'll stop here before I'm lynched in the comments.
It's the most advanced airborne weapon system ever developed.
However, there were those in the civil service who were pressing for the P-1B project to be axed, and many who thought that the type would be obsolete by the mid-1960s, which had the effect of reducing funding for various upgrades over the years. But fortunately for now, they didn't get their way, and in 1958 the aircraft was christened the Lightning, in preference to the rather grandiose name of Excalibur, which would have been my choice. The Lightning was a remarkable but temperamental aircraft. While beloved for its performance, it suffered from a high accident rate. Many losses were due to engine failures and fires, often related to fuel leaks from its complex and tightly packed fuel system. These issues nearly cost the lives of several pilots and contributed to the aircraft's reputation for being difficult and dangerous to maintain and fly. During one flight, a hot air leak from ducting ignited fuel and oil that had pooled close to the engine. The pilot managed to land safely, but the incident led to a widespread addition of under-fuselage drain points that allowed small amounts of fuel and other fluids to escape rather than accumulate internally. But even with careful maintenance, the Lightning still had a habit of catching fire at the worst possible times, due to much of the piping in the Lightning's engine bays being packed in tighter than a rush hour tube train. Unsurprisingly, this made the whole setup rather flammable. During one of the Red Top missile trials, a Lightning would become the star of what's arguably the most iconic crash photograph ever taken. It started as a routine post-engine change test flight. Partway through, the pilot got dual reheat warnings on the control panel. Nothing else seemed off, instruments were steady, handling was fine, but he made the smart call to return to base. Then, just 10 seconds from landing, flying at about 150 feet, the aircraft suddenly snapped into a violent, uncommanded pitch-up. The pilot didn't wait to ask questions, he bailed out, and his perfectly timed ejection was caught mid-air by a photographer and witnessed by a very confused tractor driver. The post-crash investigation uncovered the culprit. A flash fire in the rear fuselage had cooked the mounting points for the tailplane actuator. With those compromised, the tail lost authority and the pilot lost control. That said, the lessons learned from these early scares and the fixes that followed did make it a much safer machine over time. By 1958, the first 20 production development airframes were starting to roll out the factory, but that didn't mean that the 3 prototypes could rest. The second prototype, X-Ray Alpha 853, was kept busy until it was grounded in 1963, and the third of the 3 prototypes, X-Ray Alpha 856, was sent to Rolls-Royce for Avon engine development work until 1967. But it was X-Ray Alpha 857, the first P1B prototype, that would go on to make Britain proud. Lightning had ticked off most of its handling, performance and stability checks up to Mach 1.7, and by that point it was time to reach for Mach 2. But pushing further wasn't going to be that straightforward. Officially, the ministry had already got what it paid for, and they weren't exactly queuing up to take any unnecessary risks, as they called them. On top of that, genuine technical concerns were floating around. At these speeds, some engineers were worried about intake instability and what might happen to the airframe when it was being blasted with airflow heated to over 100 Celsius at altitude. So while most knew that the aircraft had Mach 2 in it, getting the green light to try was another matter. Eventually, a compromise was reached after a bit of polite nagging from the flight test team at Wharton. A flight was arranged using X-Ray Alpha 857, which was still fitted with the smaller fin than those found on what would be fitted on those later models of Lightnings. To build up to the big day, a few opportunity flights throughout November of 58 nudged the envelope a little further each time, creeping up to Mach 1.92 without any drama. Then on the 25th of November, X-Ray Alpha 857, Roland Beaumont and the English Electric team were ready to go. And to save every drop of fuel for the attempt, Beaumont carried out pre-flight checks while taxiing. Just 4 minutes after brakes off, Beaumont was climbing through 30,000 feet and headed for a supersonic run up the Irish Sea, avoiding land, of course, to spare the public the inconvenience of having their windows rattled by sonic booms. Reheat was lit just off the west coast of England, and by the time he levelled off at 42,000 feet, the Mach meter was already at 1.3 and climbing fast. And by Mach 1.9, the Lightning had entered the so-called danger zone, where intake buzz, thermal stress and instability had all been predicted. But Beaumont and X-Ray Alpha 857 held steady, and at Mach 1.95, the throttles were pushed to the stops, and slowly that needle kept rising. Until finally, there it was, Mach 2, solid and stable, with the Isle of Man disappearing under the wing and the RAM air temperature reading a toasty 114 Celsius. From the coast of Wales to the edge of Scotland and back in under 8 minutes. Job done. Although much to the annoyance of the locals living on the Isle of Man, who would have to put up with the constant sonic booms for the foreseeable future. Roland Beaumont, X-Ray Alpha 857 and the English Electric team had succeeded. Britain now had a Mark II fighter, eclipsing even the record set by Peter Twist in the Fairey F2D. Not bad at all, from Spitfires to Mark II in 15 years. Although this was done at the cost of very high fuel consumption, Beaumont reported that he had barely enough fuel after the run to return to base. This flight made X-Ray Alpha 857 the second European aircraft to do it, just a month behind the French Mirage 3, who had beaten us to it by a whisker. Fun fact, that flight was piloted by another Roland Galvani. Interesting anecdote about the French. I read this in an old aviation magazine a while back, so take it with a pinch of salt. Naturally, English Electric were keen to export their creation, but in the early 1960s, potential buyers started pushing back, thinking the Lightning was just a Mach 1.5 jet. It didn't take long to find out where that idea came from. Right, I'm going to try and read this without laughing. So, Back when the first Lightning Squadron stood up at Coltishall in 1960, a few French Mirage pilots came over for an exchange visit, part of a tit-for-tat deal where RAF pilots got to try out the Mirage. Because at the time the Lightning was still new, it had an RAF training limit of Mach 1.5, and that's what the French were told. Obviously, either they chose to ignore the words training limit, or they simply didn't understand. Either way, they went home and spread the word that Mach 1.5 was all the Lightning had in it. Naturally, the Mirage sales guys loved that, and they wasted no time in turning it into a selling point. You can imagine the French, "Hey Marcel, cet avion anglais, il est très long." How true the story is, I couldn't say, but knowing the long and glorious tradition of Anglo-French rivalry, I wouldn't put it past them. Because if there's even half a chance to get one over us roast beefs, you can bet your last baguette they'll take it. In all, there were 10 different production versions of the Lightning, with the P-1B becoming the F-1. These variants were part of that initial production order of 20 production development airframes. The first production Lightning F-1, X-Ray Mike 129, was rolled out for its first flight on the 29th of October 1959, with combat-ready F-1s entering squadron service with the RAF Fighter Command on the 30th of July 1960, with No. 74 Squadron, the Tiger Squadron of World War I and World War II fame, being the first unit to receive them. The F-1 variant was fitted with a pair of Rolls-Royce Avon 210 axial flow engines that could produce 11,200 pounds of thrust dry and 14,400 pounds with full reheat. These could get the F-1 with a ventral tank and missiles up to Mach 1.7 or 650 knots, whichever came first. And if pilots were not attentive, they could find themselves going supersonic in next to no time, especially as acceleration was really smooth and rapid. Even the prototype P-1 Whiskey Golf 760 had gone supersonic without the help of reheat, just to give you an idea how much power it had, even with those unsophisticated Sapphires. Although the F1 and F2 variants, which had the smaller horizontal tail, could exceed Mach 1.7, it was advised against doing so due to longitudinal handling issues. Although some efforts were made to improve yaw stability with a single fin under the ventral tank. The pilot sat in a Martin Baker Mark IV ejection seat in a relatively snug cockpit, kept cool with an air supply to prevent him from being cooked, as the outside temperatures could exceed 100 Celsius due to air friction. At his disposal, avionics-wise, he had a TACAN system as his main nav aid, backed up by an ILS for landings and an Elliott autopilot. Such refinements. From the start, the F-1 had a VHF radio and an IFF system to tell friend from foe, but it didn't have any defensive countermeasures, such as radar warning receiver to alert the pilot of a locked-on missile, nor any chaffs or flares, nothing. On takeoff, pilots would release the brakes, apply full power, and after 14 seconds of ground roll, they would lift the nose at 160 knots, and they were generally advised to allow the speed to increase to around about 220 knots before lifting the nose further to begin their climb, although many would climb a little bit more enthusiastically. In dry thrust, the pilot could climb at Mach 0.9 that could easily exceed 40 degrees, with the reheat being engaged at 25,000 feet, but without any additional fuel, the range was limited to around 850 miles. Speaking of altitude, the pilot notes clearly state that the F-1 couldn't be operated above 60,000 feet due to the limitations of the onboard oxygen regulator, but with a pressure suit and a helmet, they could go up to 66,000 feet. Armaments were just 2 Firestreak missiles that could be fired provided a pilot didn't exceed Mach 1.3 or pull more than 3G. Each missile had an arm time of 15 minutes. The total time of the onboard missile IR refrigerant would last. The Firestreak missiles could be replaced with a pack of 44 unguided rockets or an additional pair of Aiden cannons. Although the F-1 did have 2 30mm Aiden cannons firing from the top of the nose in front of the pilot with 120 rounds per gun. This tended to blind the pilot with muzzle flash and were thus not fired often, and were usually blanked off on the British Isles based Lightnings. The guns had more or less the same limitations as the Firestreaks: no firing above Mach 0.13 or above 3G or above 45,000 feet. When the F1 finally entered service, pilots loved the power of the Lightning. However, she was a handful for the unaware, having a very high stall and fast approach speeds, which gave rise to one of the Lightning's many sobriquets, the Frightening. A remark from one Lightning pilot has gone down in lore. When asked how his first flight had gone, his response was, "No sweat, I was with it all the way until I let the wheel brakes off." At this time, English Electric's aviation division merged with several other British aerospace firms to form the British Aircraft Corporation, but for the sake of continuity, I will continue to refer to English Electric. Naturally, any new type will come with its fair share of teething troubles, and the Lightning was no exception. One of the first real headaches was a serious defect in the pipework linking the ventral tank to the rest of the fuel system. Cracks had developed from fatigue, allowing pressurized fuel into the engine bays, never ideal. The fleet was swiftly grounded while a fix was thrashed out, and in typical British budget fashion, the interim solution was to simply disconnect the ventral fuel system and carry on flying with an empty tank, or in some cases without a tank at all, severely limiting its range. Despite all that, the pilot still loved the sports car performance of the F1, and as a quick reaction aircraft, they could go from cockpit readiness to engine start in less than 2 minutes, and from brake release to have their aluminium death tube sitting on the tail of a curious Soviet bear at 40,000 feet 150 seconds later. Here's a question for you. Could the Lightning have made a better frontline interceptor for NATO than the Lockheed F-104, a jet that came wrapped in political backhanders and frankly claimed more European pilot lives than the Russians ever did? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. The F-1 stayed with 74 Squadron until 1963, when they moved to Lucas and were handed the F-3. Only 19 F-1s were ever built. At the time, they were considered very sophisticated aircraft, but they were very difficult to maintain compared to the more straightforward Hunters. That one major issue was those ventral fuel tanks, which had caused a lot of problems. It quickly became apparent that a dual-control Lightning would be needed, and work began on the Lightning T4, the only supersonic side-by-side trainer in the world at the time, and built to similar spec to the F-1A, with a detachable refueling probe under the left wing. The forward fuselage, which is only just large enough for a single pilot in the fighter variants, was widened for the T4 by just under 1 foot, with the aiding guns being removed. It was no doubt a very cosy place to be, and was the aircraft in which Flight Officer Jean Oates became the first British woman to break the sound barrier flying an RAF jet in September 1962. The next single-seater was the F2, considered the ultimate Lightning of all the types, having the best power-to-weight ratio before the bloat started to set in. The upgrades included a standby DC electrical generator, a liquid oxygen breathing system which replaced the older gaseous oxygen setup. A major addition was the new OR-946 integrated flight control system, which connected the navigation avionics to an automatic flight control computer and also introduced a significantly revised cockpit layout. Powering the aircraft were Avon 210R engines, now featuring a slightly improved afterburner control system. Some 44 were built, the first X-Ray November 723 making its maiden flight on the 11th of July 1961. Deliveries took place to the Leconfield Wing No. 19 and 92 squadrons around the end of 1962. Visually, the F2 was identical to the F1 except for a small intake on the upper fuselage to cool the DC generator. British Lightnings never fired a shot in anger, but it holds the unique and somewhat dubious honour of being the first aircraft to shoot down a Harrier. This happened in 1972 when a British Harrier pilot ejected after engine failure. Strangely, the ejection force restarted the engine, and now they had a pilotless aircraft flying around heading straight for East Germany. A Lightning was scrambled to prevent a diplomatic incident, and it was tasked with intercepting and shooting down the runaway Harrier. Now, this story has been doing the rounds for donkeys of years, and whether there's any truth in the story, I'll leave that to you. Much later, 31 of these aircraft were converted to the F2A standard with a larger angular fin, a cranked and cambered wing leading edge, and provision for a ventral 610-gallon fuel tank in place of the earlier 250-gallon tank. The F3 was visually similar to its predecessor except for the squared off tail fin, which was cropped and its area increased by 15% to give the Lightning better longitudinal stability, and introduced several upgrades, most notably the more powerful Avon 301 engines, which put out 16,360 pounds of thrust with a fully variable reheat. From what I could gather, the first F3 development aircraft, X-Ray Golf 310, was a P-1B converted to the F3 prototype and first flew in November 1961, with the first production machine, X-Ray Papa 693, following on the 16th of June 1962. The F3 was, surprisingly to many, a missile-only aircraft, carrying 2 of the Red Top all-aspect missiles and the AI-23B radar set in the nose cone, meaning that the Lightning could perform a proper collision course interception for the first time instead of a tail chase intercept. The radar was hand-controlled by the pilot, who could scan the sky in front of the aircraft where a bomber could be spotted within 35 nautical miles at high altitude while keeping out of range of the target. However, the AI-23B radar did suffer from false returns from clouds, land, sea and ships, so it's just as well that the Soviets did not produce a low-level bomber force. By the time the F3 rolled out, the cockpit had been upgraded to the full OR-946 navigation and attack system, complete with a Mach II master reference gyro at its core. This meant the Lightning finally had proper inertial navigation, plus a more capable autopilot, instrument landing system and a tidier main flight display. All of it helped to take some of the pressure off the pilot, especially during high-speed intercepts or longer sorties, bringing the Lightning a bit closer to feeling like a proper 1960s Interceptor rather than something strapped together around 2 rockets. So why no guns? Well, by the time the F3 had come along, the thinking had shifted. Guns were seen as outdated, relics of World War II dogfighting, and the idea of getting into a turn-in fight was seen as a thing of the past, especially for a point defense interceptor like the Lightning, which was never meant to get into a dogfight but sprint, strike and peel away. Theoretically, the pilot would spot the bomber, fire from miles out, and the job would be done, long before anyone got close, so the guns just didn't seem necessary. However, pilots were not happy with the decision. A total of 62 F3s were built, the last one, X-Ray Romeo 720, delivered to 56 Squadron in April 1965. Some later airframes were converted to the interim F6 standard, and the few F3s were sent to the Lightning training flight at Binbrook. Some became chase aircraft, hanging on till the very end of Lightning operations. There was the F3A and interim F6. This was an attempt to extend the range of the aircraft with a longer, larger ventral tank that gave her the appearance of having a bit of a beer gut. The F3A came with a new wing design with a leading edge camber and kinked outer panels with a bit more sweep, which helped improve low speed handling. The F6 was the final and most capable Lightning variant, essentially a refined F3 with the same weapon system, but much needed improvements to range and handling, of which 62 F6s were built. This new Lightning was better aerodynamically than the older designs, though splayed ventral fins were added to preserve high-speed directional stability. The first flight of an F6, X-Ray Papa 697, took place on the 17th of April 1964, with the first production machine, X-Ray Romeo 752, flying on the 16th of June 1965. And guns made a comeback on the F6. Events had shown that guns still had a place in air combat. Soon the Arab-Israeli and Vietnam Wars would remind everyone that missiles weren't always the silver bullet they were promised to be. Close-in dogfights still would happen, and in those chaotic high-speed turn-in matches, a pair of 30mm aiding cannons could make all the difference. The RAF also took note of the disgruntled pilots who lamented their guns, and by the time the F6 rolled out, the guns were back, this time housed in a redesigned ventral tank. They put the guns in the fuel tank. Now, this may seem a little absurd to place the guns there. However, the reason was simply this. The F6 was never supposed to have guns, and in any case, there was nowhere else on the airframe to put them. One benefit of this arrangement was there was no longer any more muzzle flash to blind the pilot at night. The ventral tank held 610 gallons of fuel, or 535 gallons when the guns were fitted. Even so, this gave the F6 an endurance of just 60 minutes. To give the pilot a little extra time in the air, the F6 could also carry two unique overwing tanks called Overburgers, each holding 260 gallons, giving a total fuel load of up to 1,850 gallons, or in other words, an additional 30 minutes in the air. But these overwing tanks produced a fair amount of drag, which limited the airspeed to 525 knots or Mach 0.98 and limited maneuvers to 4G, and were therefore only meant to be used for ferrying. By the end, they flew more or less of them constantly to increase sortie time and reduce the number of takeoff and landings, hoping to extend their service life. But for the pilots, it did mean no more zipping into the heavens like hooligans. As an aside, the F3 had also been cleared for overwing tanks, improving its previous 40-minute endurance. However, I couldn't find any evidence they were ever flown operationally with the Overburgers. Power came from a pair of Avon 301Rs, each pushing out 16,300 pounds of thrust with fully variable reheat. Combined with the new cambered wing leading edge, the Lightning could reach Mach 2.27 or approximately 1,500 miles an hour at 40,000 feet, and better handling, more legs, better climb rate to escort any errant Soviet bear out of UK airspace. The Lightning F6 had pretty impressive acceleration and climb performance, although not as good as late model MiG-21s, but the Lightning's powerful Avon 301R engines do give it the unique capability of being able to fly supersonic without afterburner. Not for long, but impressive all the same, but then so could the original P1s. In a close-in dogfight, an F6 could still give aircraft like the Mirage F1 and even the F4 Phantom a tough time, though most Lightning pilots were quick to acknowledge the edge held by the newer US types like the F-15 and F-16. As mentioned, the Lightning was no slouch when it came to getting to altitude, which is unsurprising given her only purpose was to get to those high-flying Soviet bombers before they could get anywhere else near the British Isles. And the question that everyone asks is, well, how fast and how high could they go? When flown at its ideal climb profile, the Lightning could rocket up to 36,000 feet in under 3 minutes from brake release. If I were to sum up the Lightning, it would be a reusable manned missile. The aircraft's true ceiling was always something of a secret to the general public, but pilot notes and various official documents noted 60,000 plus feet, but these were mostly due to cockpit pressurization limits rather than the jet's actual capability. But within the RAF, it was an open secret that the Lightning could go much higher. In 1962, Fighter Command ran some trials against U-2 spy planes temporarily flying out of RAF Upper Heyford in the UK, which were monitoring resumed Soviet nuclear tests. In this instance, the U-2 was flying around 60 to 65,000 feet, altitudes which were considered safe from intercepts. According to some, Lightnings were able to reach that U-2, although the Lightning pilot would have had to very carefully time the zoom climb to altitude to intercept successfully. Although all the U-2 pilot had to do was adjust his course slightly, and had the U-2 taken evasive action, the Lightning pilot would have been left with an empty sky. Former RAF pilot Brian Carroll claims to have once taken a Lightning F-53 over Saudi Arabia to an altitude of 87,300 feet. He recalled the Earth's curvature was clearly visible, the sky fading to black and flight controls becoming extremely delicate, flying on a knife edge as he put it. But that wasn't the ceiling just yet. During a NATO exercise in 1984, Flight Lieutenant Mike Hale pushed Lightning X-Ray Romeo 749 to intercept the U-2 at an altitude Americans assumed was untouchable. He reached a staggering 88,000 feet, but not in sustained level flight, but using a ballistic zoom climb, accelerating hard and trading speed for height. Hale also took part in time to climb and acceleration trials against the F-104 starfighters in Denmark, where the Lightning bested its opponents in every race except one, low-level supersonic acceleration, which ended in a draw. Here's a fun one. During British Airways trials in 1985, Concorde was used as a live intercept target. Despite attempts by F-15s, F-16s, F-14s, Mirages and F-104s, only Lightning X-Ray Romeo 749 once again piloted by Hale, managed to catch a supersonic airliner from behind. But then it was an interceptor. The others were not interceptors, except if you count the F-104 Starfighter. I digress. However, as with all good things, everything eventually ends. By 1974, the RAF Lightnings were starting to be replaced with the F-4 Phantom, another beautiful machine. Fatigue cracks were starting to be discovered in the F-6 wing routes, which after a program of strengthening extended their service lives, but the writing was on the wall. The Lightning training flight that had birthed so many pilots closed its doors in August 1987, followed by a gradual phasing out of Lightning squadrons, with number 11 squadron being the last to fly them in spring 1988, replacing them with the Tornado. The final flight of a pair of RAF Lightnings in Britain was out of Binbrook to Cranfield on the 30th of June 1988. However, the Lightning was not yet done. South African company Thunder City bought 3 of these aircraft, one 2-seat trainer and a pair of single-seat F-6s, which flew until a fatal crash which grounded the fleet by 2010. Although the Lightning may one day take to the sky again, thanks to the Anglo-American Lightning Organization, which, from what I can gather, is currently restoring a 2-seat Mach T5 that they estimate will be flight ready by 2026. There is much more to the Lightning that I could possibly reasonably add to this video and do it justice, such as the time Taffy Holden, an engineer, accidentally took off in a Lightning during routine maintenance at RAF Lynham, or the Lightnings in Germany during the Cold War. So I'm currently working on the next Lightning story right now. Those who know will know what that story will be, as I've mentioned the Type F-53 a few times in this video. But it's such a good story that I didn't really think that I could squeeze it into this particular chapter and really give it the meat that it deserves. So that's going to be for a different video. I really hope you've enjoyed this story on the development life of the Lightning. It's been a long time in the making, so please, if you could, leave a like or even a comment to feed the YouTube algorithm. So until the next time, I thank you so much for watching, so take care, and now it's time to put the kettle on.